In the Star Wars Legends expanded universe, Grand Admiral Gilad Pellaeon is probably one of the most iconic characters introduced by the books. He was first introduced as the captain of the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, and he went on to become the Supreme Commander not just of the Imperial military, but also, from 36 to 40 ABY, the entire Galactic Alliance, a federation of the Imperial Remnant, New Republic, and other smaller states like the Hapens. He was prominent enough that he is, like Thrawn himself, one of the few characters to originate in books and then be brought into not only comics and games, but also animated and even live-action TV shows. But alongside that status as an iconic character, you'll often hear that Pellaeon's empire was a different empire and that he fixed the empire. But what does that actually mean, and just how true is it? Aside from fan debates, it gets most explicitly stated in the New Essential Guide to Characters, which says, quote, "Life in Pellaeon's Imperial Remnant is much like life in the New Republic. Slavery is forbidden and blatant alien prejudice is rare. The Admiral deserves much of the credit for these advances," end quote. But this Pellaeon polishing isn't necessarily in line with a lot of what we see about both him and the Empire in a lot of other books that actually take place in these periods. And I think the reality of his character in things like the New Jedi Order series is actually a lot more interesting than this post-hoc attempt to claim that actually he was a good guy and he made the Empire good, so it's fine for everyone to cooperate with them. Because for the glimpses we do see into this relationship and into the Empire, this doesn't really hold up. There's three parts to this that I think are important to talk about. One is simply what Pellaeon's position within the Empire actually was, another is what Pellaeon's goals were, and the third is how the Empire really ended up looking under his leadership. For the first part, while Pellaeon is typically talked about as the leader of the Empire overall at this point, his true position is simply as a military leader, not a political leader. That still falls to the Moffs. Since most of the way we see the Imperial Remnant is as an enemy for the New Republic in battle, or even just as a military ally later on, leading the fleet does put him in a position where he is the most relevant leader for sources to talk about. But while he spearheads certain initiatives like the alliance with the New Republic against the Yuuzhan Vong and the Pellaeon-Gavrisum Treaty ending the Galactic Civil War, these are things he's spearheading in the context of him leading the Imperial fleet, and politically it's still required that he get the Moffs on board. In a state as militaristic as the Imperial Remnant, his position and long service does come with a lot of respect and influence within the Empire, especially when it comes to military matters, but that has limits and doesn't necessarily mean he's able to shape the state to his will. And I think equally relevantly, doesn't mean his will actually extends all that far into opinions on how the Empire should be governed in the day-to-day. We'll get to this more directly in a bit, but we do see some of the limits of his power when he wants the Empire to get more involved with the fight against the Yuuzhan Vong, and it takes him a significant amount of time to gather backing for that. It's not until the Yuuzhan Vong are directly attacking the Empire that the Moffs are willing to agree to his plan to jump in with the New Republic. Given how much the humanocentric policies of the Empire relied upon force to uphold them, there is the added caveat that while Pellaeon couldn't dictate policy directly, the cooperation of the fleet or the military more generally would be a big part of their ability to uphold them. So if Pellaeon had the will, I can at least see slavery as something Pellaeon could have had an impact on, should it have been something that he felt strongly enough in opposing. Governments have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, but when they have so much power invested in the fleet and the fleet won't listen to them, then ultimately that does mean that political power rests with the fleet rather than with the Moffs. So then that gets us to what Pellaeon's actual aims were, because the idea that he fixed the Empire frankly gives him way too much credit in this direction. When we see Pellaeon going toe-to-toe with the Moffs, it's not over expanding civil rights in the Empire. Despite every character having at least some variance in how they're portrayed, one thing that is very consistent about Pellaeon is that he thinks of the Imperial fleet as his home, and that is his primary motivation, making sure that the fleet is in a good position. When he sues for peace with the New Republic in the Hand of Thrawn duology, it isn't because he feels like it's the morally right thing to do. It's because he has pragmatically decided that the Empire cannot survive if it continues to fight against them. But more importantly, the Empire can't survive if they don't like this video and subscribe for more. He makes this incredibly clear when he's pushing for the peace deal, saying the Empire is fighting for a claim on the galaxy they've already lost, but also that he's no more happy about conceding defeat than any of the other Moffs or military officers. A similar but more forceful approach is taken when he's insisting that the Empire join the New Republic in the fight against the Yuuzhan Vong in the New Jedi Order series, saying that he was going to commit the Empire's forces when the New Republic requested aid, regardless of what the Moffs thought, since the Empire would definitely be destroyed after the New Republic if they didn't assist. And, in the words of Moff Seretti, who was supportive of Pellaeon, they would deserve it in that case. When the Empire received the New Republic's request for help, well, Pellaeon did want to step in, and some Moffs like Seretti wanted to step in, many of the Moffs still felt like they should just let the New Republic burn, and felt like they'd be able to build something from the ashes. Completely ignoring the fact, which Pellaeon was well aware of, that when the New Republic was out of the way, there would be nothing stopping the Yuuzhan Vong from focusing all of their might on the Empire and pretty much immediately crushing them. So Pellaeon was able to at least briefly convince the Moffs to help the New Republic in their defense. But this is where we can see some of the limits in Pellaeon's power after this initial cooperation. The Empire and the New Republic were unable to successfully defend the planet Ethor, and a still insular and scared Empire recalled Pellaeon, halting the cooperation even though Pellaeon was expressing an interest in continuing to work with the New Republic. Like I mentioned, it wasn't until towards the end of the war, when attacks picked up on the Empire, that the Empire decided to follow Pellaeon's advice and actually join the New Republic more fully. But again here, when we actually get examples of Pellaeon pressuring the Moffs, it's specifically because it makes pragmatic sense to do so for their own survival, not because he wants to push for some internal political change. If any particular quality can be ascribed to Pellaeon, it's that he's pragmatic enough that his ideology, which we will be getting to, does not override his ability to realistically assess what he's doing. And this is something the New Jedi Order books, when setting up the relationship between the Empire and New Republic, directly call out on a few occasions. In particular, there's a quote from Ace Pilot and generally on the right side of history Wedge Antilles in The Final Prophecy, which sums up my own thoughts on Pellaeon pretty well. Quote, "The best thing about Pellaeon was that he knew his limitations," Wedge said. "Don't get me wrong, he's a very good tactician and excellent at command, but when Thrawn died, he didn't kid himself that he could salvage the battle. That alone set him apart from most Imperial commanders, who more usually had inflated opinions of themselves. It's why we were able to beat them early on. The Vong are a little like that," end quote. Wedge doesn't go into the alliance with particularly warm feelings for Pellaeon. He expresses a lot of skepticism about working with the Empire, and that includes Pellaeon himself. But over time, I think especially in things like sourcebooks, the fact that Pellaeon was so willing to work with the New Republic, and was at least polite to them, gets reinterpreted as him not actually believing in what the Empire stood for. At his core, Pellaeon was and remained an authoritarian, with his core value beyond the survival of the fleet being order, not justice. This is again highlighted when the New Jedi Order is exploring the differences between the Empire and the New Republic, showing the uneasy alliance as it forms. When Leia visits the Remnant to negotiate with Pellaeon, and Pellaeon talks about his garden, calling the weak and allowing the strong to survive in a perfectly ordered environment, Pellaeon explicitly mentions this as a metaphor for society, talking about how from a garden one learns to cull the weak and unfit. Pellaeon was not with the Empire by accident. He didn't go from bad Imperial leader to bad Imperial leader because he somehow didn't believe in what the Empire had done. When the initial cooperation does occur at Ethor, one of the admirals working with Pellaeon is a Bothan named Crefei, who does go out of his way to mention that he never experienced any anti-alien bias from Pellaeon. But Pellaeon also never seems to object to the anti-alien bias of others when it's expressed. It's certainly not a primary motivation of his to root that out in the Empire. He was with the Empire long enough, with enough opportunities to leave it beforehand, that even if we take Crefei's experience to be some universal truth about how Pellaeon actually feels, rather than just what he experienced when working with someone as an equal, he never seems to consider the anti-alien bias and oppression in the Empire to be worth the sacrifice of the order that he thinks this authoritarian government can bring. After all, while the character guide absolves the Empire of Pellaeon's time of the anti-alien biases which came before, crediting him with the achievement, what we actually see of the Empire in this period doesn't match with that sentiment at all. In the Hand of Thrawn duology, when Pellaeon is just barely scraping by in his plans to save the Empire by negotiating a peace deal, one of the conferences with the other Imperial military leaders, specifically High General Sut Ramik, we see the deal getting opposed specifically because of anti-alien bias. He says about the plan, quote, "The New Republic is going to self-destruct. You know it and I know it. The only questions are how violent the explosion will be and whether the trigger will be this Kamas thing we keep hearing about or something else. There's no need for us to humiliate ourselves in front of aliens and alien lovers this way," end quote. And this isn't just one random guy, it's one of the most influential military leaders that Pellaeon is working with, where Pellaeon is banking on his support to bring other military members in line. From one of the other Imperial point of view characters, a special agent named Dren Nevet, we get another appearance of the alien lover's phrase. This was not a particularly rare feeling. I think it's important to keep in mind that many of the people leading this empire are essentially some of the most unreconstructed hardliners you could get, given they were still fighting almost 20 years after Endor. Yet another character, Captain Nalgal of the Star Destroyer Tyrannic, which alone should give you an idea of who the bad guys just might be, also uses the alien lover epithet for the New Republic twice in Vision of the Future. When faced with this objection from Ramik, Pellaeon doesn't agree with it, but he also doesn't push against it in any way. He just says he understands that's Ramik's position and moves on. On the one hand, that can be read as fair because he's trying to get a very specific goal accomplished, but in the broader context of the Empire, the fact that Ramik says, you know it and I know it to Pellaeon and uses alien lovers like that, thinking it'll get traction, doesn't read to me like alien rights has been a near and dear topic Pellaeon has been pressuring on for years, let alone one that he'd made significant progress on, to the point that living in the Empire was the same as living in the New Republic. There seems to be this fundamental idea that progress on issues like this is based on just getting the right guy in power, pointing the ship and saying steady as she goes towards freedom, which in this case Pellaeon doesn't even really seem to be doing. At best, he had an incredibly paternalistic attitude towards aliens and how you're supposed to govern them. One of the attitudes that Pellaeon comes up against is the same idea that the New Republic is going to implode because all of those different species could never live together peacefully. According to Moff Andri, quote, "That was the whole philosophic basis for the Emperor's new order in the first place. Alone of all those in the Imperial Senate, he understood that so many diverse species and cultures could never live together without a strong hand governing them," end quote. And Pellaeon flat out says he agrees to this. He only thinks that the New Republic is going to last long enough that it crushes the Empire first, and he's trying to make sure the Empire is still around to take advantage of the New Republic's collapse. And there are other areas where we see things not entirely matching with this sourcebook claim of a more liberalized empire. On the topic of quality of life, it mentions life not being that different between the Imperial Remnant and the New Republic, but in other places like Darktide Ruin, Leia's reading a brief on the Empire, and there's mentions of massive wealth extraction going to the core with some of the former warlords, and with the Empire not having recovered from poverty afterwards. So you do also have to ask, not that different for who? Who is the power actually benefiting? Imperials basically blame the New Republic or the rebels for infecting their culture and economy. That isn't to say that there was absolutely no progress. Some small numbers of aliens were seen in the Stormtrooper Corps under Dalla's leadership before Pellaeon and Darksaber, something which was far more rare under the Emperor. It became even more common 100 years later under the Fel Empire, which is its own topic, but they were still incredibly rare. What we never really end up seeing, though, are higher-ranking Imperial leaders or commander in this period who were alien themselves. So for all the talk of not being anti-alien, there isn't any actual evidence of equality. And this is despite the fact that the part of the rim the Empire was on was famous for certain species of aliens. Mutalisk was one of the most important planets in the Remnant, but while a civilian financier in the Hand of Thrawn duology could be read as a retconned Mun, given that he's described as lean and wearing traditional garb of Mutalisk, all of the actual officials we ever see are explicitly human, and when we do hear any of them express an opinion on aliens, it's not a very epic one. You have some of the Imperial leadership expressing outright hostility about aliens, but the other camp we get is what Andre proposes, which is what Pellaeon seems to mostly align with, where the aliens need to be governed by a strong, firm hand if everyone wants to get along, and it just so happens that that firm hand is always going to have to be human. If the Empire had actually increased the access of non-humans to power, they probably wouldn't always be talking about the New Republic as the alien lovers. Between Natassi Dalla as the fleet's leader before Pellaeon and Moffs like Moff Crowell of Valk 7, we do seem to have a higher proportion of women in power though. We see the anti-alien sentiment yet again when the talks to form the Galactic Alliance are beginning in earnest. Pellaeon uses his influence to make it clear the Empire will be joining the alliance against the Vong, lest the fleet abandon the Moffs to their own devices. Luke Skywalker, Mara Jade, and Jacen Solo are there, assisting the Empire in their defense against the Yuuzhan Vong, and when Jacen is trying to convince a particularly ornery Moff, Fennec, to abandon Yaga Minor and defend somewhere else, he goes on what Jacen calls an anti-life tirade, ending with, quote, "I'm not stupid, boy, I'm not senile. Who do you take me for? I was hunting Eloms decades before you were born." He was trying to bait Jason into getting angry with him and debating alien rights, but Jason just says he wasn't going to try to force his own morality on anyone. And again, we have something that's kind of a side issue in the moment, but it comes to a core point. The Empire is never really pushed to abandon these policies or attitudes in its leaders, despite the assertion of the new Essential Guide to Characters. Pellaeon himself may not have genocide or enslavement of alien species on his personal to-do list, and maybe at some point it is true that he even argued against or forbade the fleet's resources being used to further slavery in the regions the Empire still inhabited, but we're still a very far cry from actual equality. So I really think there isn't any question that no, the Empire was not fixed by Pellaeon. It was still an authoritarian state, and Pellaeon was still an authoritarian. That's why he liked the Empire, even if he softened over time and was a better influence on it than others. There is a second half to the character guide, quote, saying, "But Pellaeon could have defected to the rebellion during the Emperor's New Order, as did Yondo Donna, Crix Maydeen, Tycho Selchu, and countless others. Instead, he knowingly served a regime responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history. For some citizens, Pellaeon's good deeds will never bring him absolution." Pellaeon may have slowly stopped certain practices from being as openly accepted in the Empire if we try to give more credit to the sourcebook quote, despite what we see from Imperials throughout the later periods of Legends, but he did it by fighting in opposition to the idea that these practices should stop altogether. To give him all the credit possible and say that the order he thought he was fighting for was worth all of the other injustices that go along with it, that there's some price to pay, that should lose any value when you consider he'd lived through decades of the rebellion and infighting caused by the exact leadership he was saying brought order to the galaxy. It's not like he had no alternative but to work within the multiple crumbling warlord regimes he'd served over the time after Endor. Saying that the Empire was only able to push back somewhat against the New Republic through his skills as a commander isn't really praise for him as a political actor. If he had such respect among the fleet and he had made an earlier move to join the Rebellion or New Republic, or at least oppose the very clear problems posed by the Moffs, many areas under Imperial rule would have been freed of some kind of authoritarianism earlier. But Pellaeon just fundamentally doesn't think the authoritarian rule is the problem. So again, even if you disagree with that and you want to take the most generous possible interpretation of Pellaeon and his brand of support for authoritarianism ending up being somehow benevolent, which I personally don't, I think Pellaeon himself provides the best arguments against this position. In The Swarm War, the final book of the sequel trilogy to the New Jedi Order series, Luke Skywalker is talking about reforming the Jedi Council under his own leadership. And Pellaeon, who wanted increased Jedi influence in the government, something which does reflect an evolving position within him, at least somewhat, tells Luke the council would be, quote, "a workable organization as long as you're the one at the head of it," end quote. And I would turn that back around on his position. Pellaeon was, given many of the examples we've talked about, at best holding back the very worst instincts of a government he was directly responsible for shielding from blowback, and making sure it would be propped up for as long as possible. Even if he's dragged them just past the edges of acceptability, kicking and screaming, he's still leaving the exact same tools and individuals who would go back over that line given the chance in his absence, and he's not exactly young. That's going to do it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Special thanks, as always, to the patrons whose names you're seeing on screen right now for their support, which makes this channel possible. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a link in the description, but also consider leaving a like and subscribing for more while you're here. It's always appreciated. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.